Good morning, Dr. Nasir.
Good morning, ma'am. Let me begin. Okay.
A very good morning to all present. We, the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, are delighted to welcome you all to 4th day of National Workshop on Research Methodology in Literary Studies and Humanities. We are honored to have you all with us, and without any further delay, I would like to request the convener of this workshop, Dr. Nasir Bhatt, for a formal welcome address. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaista. Dear colleagues, members of the organizing committee, dear scholars of the department, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all. It gives me an immense pleasure to welcome you to the day 4 of the 5 days online national workshop on research methodology in literary studies and humanities. I hope the previous sessions of this workshop have proved to be useful learning experience to you, and I am sure today's sessions will be equally illuminating and enlightening for us all. I'm very much delighted to introduce to you the resource person of this session, Dr. Vandana Sharma, whom I must introduce to you as one of my teachers and with whom I have been fortunate enough to have worked as a colleague in the Department of English, Central University of Jammu. Dr. Vandana Sharma will be delivering her talk on research in literary studies, identifying gaps and constructing questions. Dr. Sharma is an associate professor and head Department of English, Central University of Jammu. Before joining the Central University in September 2017, Dr. Sharma was Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences and Head, Department of Languages and Literature, Sri Mata Vaishno Devi University, Katra, Jammu and Kashmir. Dr. Sharma's research focuses on post-colonial literature, especially Nigerian and Indian writings in English and ecofeminism. Besides having presented and published research articles in various national and international conferences and journals, Dr. Sharma has published 5 books, out of which one is a critical work and 3 are Dogri to English translations. Dr. Sharma is associated with various national and international bodies as a member of Executive Committee and is convener of the Jammu chapter of English Language Teachers Association of India. She is member of the editorial board of Journal of English Language Teaching, that is a peer-reviewed UGC care-listed journal, and English Studies Today, a Scopus indexed journal. On behalf of the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, NIT Srinagar, and on behalf of my colleagues, co-organizers, scholars, and participants, I'm pleased to warmly welcome Dr. Vandana Sharma to the present session of the workshop. Welcome, ma'am, and thanks for being with us. I now request Dr. Sharma to illuminate the audience with her learned ideas and research experience. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nasir. It's really a pleasure to be part of this venture of yours, a wonderful and very timely workshop on research methodology. And while I was going through the entire program, I was really thrilled to see that it has been quite meticulously planned by the organizers and by the convener, Dr. Nasir. First of all, my compliments. And of course, thanks to you for giving me this opportunity to be interacting with these young scholars. I can see that it's quite a good number of participants you have. And it's equally satisfying indeed to see that when your own students, in a way, Dr. Nasir had been a research scholar here in the department and thereafter a colleague as well, as he mentioned. So it's always gratifying to see when your own, students are doing so well. So it's definitely a feather in our cap here in the Central University of Jammu. And keep up the good work, Dr. Nasir, and all the other, scholars of the department and various other participants. A very good morning to all of you. It's indeed a great pleasure. And I'm sure that with Professor Anil Raina, Professor Roshan, and various other I could see the other day. I wanted to be part of this. I mean, listening to my other colleagues, but the administrative and the academic work keeps us tied up always. So the topic which, while I discussed with Dr. Nasir, given to me particularly, is related to literature review and how to formulate your research problems. When we look at research, I'm sure by this time all of you have been well acquainted with the entire idea of conducting a very exhaustive and a very meticulous, methodical kind of research methodology while undertaking your research, right? And today I would be throwing light, I would be discussing with you all about the relevance of literature review, formulating the research problems. And here I come over to my presentation. I'm sure my presentation is visible to everyone now.
Yes, ma'am. This is quite visible.
Shall I do it? Shall I enlarge it a bit, or that's fine?
That's fine, ma'am.
That's fine?
It's now fine. Better.
Better, yeah. So here, I would be speaking about conducting literature review and formulating research questions and identifying research gaps, which I would say is the very foundation, is the very basic thing, is the very, fundamental thing as soon as a research scholar undertakes a research in any area. Obviously, of course, here I would be focusing more on literary studies because I can see this is being organized by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. So, the focus much more would be on the literary studies, but of course on the social sciences as well, right? So as you can see in this very interesting picture, and if I make use of the analogy of the stairs, right? So the analogy of the stairs itself gives you the idea that how research is an organized and systematic way of finding answers to your questions. And of course, as you can see in this very interesting picture, that how this gentleman is holding a big, huge bulb at his back. So that, of course, is reflective of the fact that while entering this journey of illumination, of enlightenment, of course, one has to be very systematic. So if you just look at the definition, 2 points are very clear. Research has to be organized, it has to be systematic, and it's one of the ways of finding answers to your questions. And this forms the the very fundamental idea of any of the research scholar who undertakes research. Here, I would like to begin with an epigraph by Robertson, a very illuminated Shakespeare Chaucer scholar, who had done tremendous amount of work on Geoffrey Chaucer, and he encapsulates the entire idea of research in literary studies when he says that the task of undertaking a literary text from an earlier generation as it was initially resented is formidable, right? So since as a Chaucer scholar, he had looked at Chaucer from various, as a very illuminating, acclaimed Chaucer scholar, a medieval scholar, Robertson, he says that whenever you are taking up any text from an earlier generation, it definitely is a formidable task. We cannot, on the basis of evidence available, reconstruct completely any period in the past. And our understanding will always be impeded to a certain extent by the conventions of our times, which change continuously, but from which no one can escape entirely. But this act should act as a stimulus rather than a deterrent. So this point is very, very important. Whenever any scholar is undertaking any research, so that entire journey begins. That entire journey begins with in a very formidable manner. It's a very formidable task. It's a very arduous task wherein a scholar is required to make in a very consistent effort. But then he says that it should not act as a deterrent, because a lot of research, whenever you begin with any kind of work, you see that there is tremendous amount of work which has been carried on a particular area, perhaps, which is there. Speaking out of my own experience, when we are conducting say our PhD admissions and we ask the research scholars to submit maybe a research proposal. So what we come across, that the students, they come up with a research proposal, or maybe they talk something which has already been which is already over researched to some extent, or maybe a particular kind of trend flows that everyone is talking about that particular area only, right? But as Robertson mentions, that there will always be something more to be done. The frontiers before us have no limit, right? So the frontiers before us have no limit encapsulates the enormity of the task which a researcher undertakes, right? So if literary studies are divorced from the larger concerns of cultural history, they will eventually wither away. So as you know that how language and culture is very much encapsulated, it is very much reflected in the literature, right? So this is what is the concern of Robertson here, right? Now coming over to the three types of research, broadly touching upon all these areas, I will move on to that how we arrive at the point of identifying a research problem, right? So the three types of research which Hilway had identified, the first is the fact finding, right? Which is the primary function, as you know, the primary function of any kind of research, of course, is to identify the facts. That is, things that are rare, known to exist, or to be true, or form a part of verified information. So fact finding aims at helping lay a very strong foundation for future work, and is in evidence in the writing of, in the writing of biographies and bibliographies, right? Even evaluating any kind of biographies of writers are complete and reliable when they include contributions of these writers to literary studies. So similarly, if we look at the annotated bibliographies, which are so comprehensive, which are trustworthy only when they contain some explanatory notes meant to guide future researchers about what to read and what to and what not, right? So what is important here to understand is that fact finding in literary research, that what is the kind of fact you are trying to find in literary research. Another important point is about the critical interpretation. Now, the essence of critical interpretation lies in analysis and classification of perspective readings on works, right? So critical interpretation, it is characterized by three features in the main with regard to arguments. Number one is the agreements on the facts, on the known facts and the principles governing the area of inquiry, right? So when we are looking at the critical, because whenever you are conducting a literary research, it is basically about doing a critical analysis. This is what actually we always say, that we are developing the critical acumen of our students, right? So critical interpretation is characterized by three factors, three features we can say. Number one is the agreements on the known facts and the principles which are governing the area of inquiry. Number two is a very clear and reasonable and logical argument, which is leading to a very verifiable kind of conclusions. marked for being honest for the reader to accept. And then, of course, a rational estimation, how rationally you are, trying to accept the facts which have been put forth by the researcher, right? So in this three types of research, when we move on to the complete research, a term which Hilve himself perhaps used for want of a better option, right? Wherein he says it combines both the fact finding. This is what you do in research, fact finding on reasoning. So neither fact finding nor critical interpretation in itself leads to any solution. One needs complete research. As you can see, I have already highlighted that. So complete research consists of solving a problem, right? The problem to be solved, body of the strong evidence, which of course in your case, in case of social sciences, or in case of literary studies for that matter, is the strong evidence vis-a-vis the problem which you have identified, body of the evidence which is organized quite logically to find a solution and a definite conclusion, right? So here, if we just look at, say, any of the autobiographical narrative of a writer, right? So the autobiographical narrative of a writer, what kind of cultural connotations it is giving, what kind of cultural context it is showing, what kind of, say, if we just look at the plight of the marginalized people in that particular biography, or say, is trying to explicitly bring forth, right? So that becomes a very complete research wherein there is a fact finding coupled with the critical interpretation, right? Now, research, as I said earlier, research in literary studies is a systematic investigation and the study of sources, materials. So here, in order to establish facts, analysis and interpretation of text to arrive at conclusion. So obviously it is a very systematic analysis and interpretation of text. Now, it is not only the primary text in your case, it is the secondary material which we lay emphasis upon to a great deal, which forms the bedrock of your research, right? Now, moving on to the nature and the characteristics of the research, right? As I said earlier, which all of you, I'm sure, are quite clear by this time, that how research is a very systematic structure of investigating into the, compressing into an organic unity. There has to be objectivity, there has to be precision, and there has to be design, right? So here comes our topic, here comes our concern, that how can we design the problem? How can you problematize an issue which you want to undertake in research? How do you give your research statement or the hypothesis, right, which you feel that A is equal to B, that, does it really comes over to B, right? And the collection and analysis of data, sometimes, it is applicable if you're undertaking, say, a research in English language teaching. So it depends, right? However, broadly speaking, in research, designing the research problem becomes important. Now, just touching upon, all of you understand by this time that we have the two broad types of research, right? The fundamental research, which formulates, expands, and evaluates a theory, or the second type, in fundamental, the second subtype becomes the expanding the frontiers of knowledge. So the kind of research which we undertake comes in the fundamental type, right? Sometimes in the language teaching, with the emergence of the digital humanities, of course, so we are entering the realms of much more multidisciplinary and the transdisciplinary domain. So of course, now we have the applied research at the same time, which finds a solution to an immediate and a practical problem. Now, for a researcher to begin with, the first thing is how to select a research problem, right? How can a researcher select a research problem? How to construct one hypothesis? How to identify some philosophical questions? Because, many times what I've seen is that researchers, they condense various things, right? So research is not only about condensing or, compiling or collating, but it's much more about conducting a very critical kind of exercise, right? So Qualitative, of course, the kind of research which we conduct is qualitative in nature. So that qualitative and quantitative debate is always there in research. So a researcher has to navigate, a researcher has to understand that, yes, what is the kind of method which I'm going to apply, selecting a method for research or the set of methods as we say. Now, identification of a research problem is the first concern for any researcher. That's the first step. As you see, if there are 100 steps, obviously that is the first step. Identification of research problem, which refers to the sense of awareness of a prevalent social problem, right? A social phenomena or a concept that is worth study, as it requires to be investigated, as it requires to be understood. So the researcher identifies such a research problem through observation, through knowledge, through wisdom, and through skills. Right now, let me give you the example. I'll just come to that here. Okay, we can move on later on. Right. Right. So identification of the research problem definitely refers to the sense of being how aware you are of the prevalent social conditions or the social problem or the social phenomena, right? How much observation you have, how much knowledge do you have as a researcher, and how does that knowledge and observation, of course, in the present scenario when everything is available at the click of your mouse, so it has become very, very I would say simpler at the same time, but of course challenging. Simpler because you can easily in a short span of time conduct a very quick kind of survey to see what are the trends in a particular area, what are the social problems which are being navigated, which are being investigated in the research. But at the same time, you have to have that kind of acumen to understand the criticality, number one, and the relevance of the problem. Right now, types of research problem itself becomes very, very important. What is the kind of research you are going to take, right? So there are 4 types of research problems. This is very, very important to understand. These 4 kinds of research problems. The first one, the casuist research problem, right? So casuist research problem, difference research problem, descriptive research problem. Now you have to understand relational research problem. You have to understand that where do you figure? Where does your research figure? The research which you are undertaking or the problem which you are identifying, where does it figure? Say, for example, let's take the first example, the casuist research problem. So this casuist, it has its, connection with the sophist, right? The great Greek philosophers who were, say, Plato and Aristotle and the Socrates, how they were dealing with the issues of the moral good and bad, right? So the casuist research problem, this type of problem, primarily relates to the determination of right and wrong in the questions of conduct or in the questions of conscience by analyzing the moral dilemmas. And how do they do it? They do it by the application of the general rules, the careful distinction. So it is very much casuist research problem. This kind of problem is very much grounded in theory. Say, for example, we say, what is the influence of using language games? What is the influence of using communicative language games upon the English learners? Right? So that becomes a very casuist kind of research problem, where you are just looking at that are the communicative language games, they are having a very good impact upon the young learners, the English language learners, or otherwise, right? So to illustrate it further, that casuist research problem relates to the determination of right and wrong in the conduct of our own conscience, in the way human society progresses, the kind of moral dilemmas which we have. But of course, it is done in a very systematic way through the application of the general rules, careful distinction of the special cases. Right? Now, the second type of research problem is your difference research problem. Right? Difference research problem is the one which typically asks the question. The question like, is there a difference between two or more groups or the treatments? Is there a difference between the treatment which is meted over to the children and the adults? Is there a difference between that rural urban divide? So this type of problem is used when the researcher compares or contrasts two or more phenomena. Right. So this is a very, very common approach in defining a problem, primarily in clinical social sciences and in behavioral sciences. Right. Difference research problem, wherein the researcher typically asks the questions which are related to the difference, between two or more groups or treatments. So this type of research problem is used when the researcher is employing the technique of comparing and contrasting, as the word itself depicts, comparing and contrasting two or more phenomena. Now the third type is your descriptive research problem. So descriptive research problem typically asks the question, what is, with the underlying purpose to describe the significance of a situation, state, or existence of a specific phenomena. So this problem is often associated with the revealing hidden or understudied issues, right? Say, how literature is reflecting the connection between the intersection of the exploitation of nature and the subjugation of women, right? So the revealing hidden or understudied issues which have not been associated are reflected over in this descriptive research problem. And then the relational research problem, as the name itself depicts, it suggests a kind of relationship of some sort between two or more variables to be investigated, right? So herein, of course, the researcher investigates specific qualities, characteristics that may be connected in one way or the other, right? Say the issue of caste, class, ethnicity, and gender. How do they intersect in the works of a particular writer, right? So herein, that kind of relationship which the researcher is trying to figure out, which the researcher is trying to connect and find a relationship, that how does the caste, class, ethnicity, and gender intersect, say in Kashmiri writings, or say in Dogri women writers, right? That how does these issues they intersect? So this becomes another important research problem for a researcher to undertake. Now, a research problem must be definitely a lead-in that helps ensure the reader will maintain interest over the study. Obviously, whenever you are thinking of taking up a research problem, it originates from your own knowledge, it originates from your observation, and of course, it needs to have that declaration of originality. For example, mentioning a knowledge void becomes very, very important. And that knowledge void, how can you think of that knowledge void? How can you identify that knowledge void? Here, of course, that is to be supported by the literature review. So literature review becomes a very, very fundamental and significant aspect of conducting research, followed by methodology, right? So an indication of the central focus of the study must be reflected in the research problem, and an explanation of the study's significance or the benefits to be derived from an investigating the problem. So a research problem must be encompassing, must be focusing upon all these four aspects. A lead-in that helps ensure the reader will maintain interest over the study. If I look at your research, yes, I find it interesting. I find it that, yes, this is something I would like to know about, right? A research problem should also be having a declaration of originality, as I said earlier, and how that declaration of originality you can substantiate, that is only by identifying the research knowledge void, which of course is supported by the literature review. I'm just coming over to the nitty-gritties, the nuances of literature review, and an indication of the central focus of the study has to be there in the research problem, and an explanation of study's significance or benefits which can be derived from investigating the problem. Right now, what are the sources? What are the sources of problems? Right now, this becomes very, very important. Right, sources of problem, the identification of a problem to study can be very challenging, of course, right? Not because there are lack of issues that could be investigated, but due to challenge of formulating an academically relevant and researchable problem, which is unique, number one, and which does not simply duplicate the works which has been undertaken by other research scholars. Right, so to facilitate how you might select a problem from which to build a research study, consider these points as your source of inspiration. Right, this is very, very important. Please note this, right? Because it's not that there are any lack of issues. So identifying the research problem is a difficult task, not because there are lack of issues which could be investigated, but because formulating an academically relevant research problem and a researchable problem, which is unique and which of course does not duplicate others, right? So these the inspiration can be drawn from these points. Number one is deductions from the theory. Right, what we mean by deductions from the theory, as it shows that this relates to deductions which can be made from social philosophy or generalizations which are embodied in life and in society that the researcher is familiar with. Number one, these deductions can be from the human behavior. So the deductions from the human behavior are then placed within the empirical frame of reference through research. So from a theory, the researcher can formulate a research problem or hypothesis, stating the expected findings in certain empirical situations. The research asks the questions like, what relationship between variables will be observed if theory aptly summarizes the state of affairs? Right, one can then design, say for example, if Vandana Shiva, one of the prominent eco-feminists, if she has given, if she has termed the development in our country or in the post-colonial societies as maldevelopment, right? So how does this theory of maldevelopment, which she has talked about, right? How does this theory find its, expression in the works or in the society at the same time? Say, for example, the texts which are written by C.K. Janu, right? So how does C.K. Janu, she looks at that aspect of maldevelopment, that commercialized, capitalized, and masculinistic perspectives of the society, right? So deductions from the theory can always be drawn, and they can always be, looked as the variables which can then be aptly summarized, which can aptly summarize the state of affairs. So one can then design and carry out a very systematic investigation to assess whether the empirical data confirm or reject the hypothesis. But of course, literary studies, you do not collect that kind of empirical data. But of course, from the theoretical framework, you can deduce and you can formulate your research problems. The second one is very, very interesting, and with the recent focus upon lot of interdisciplinary problem, right? So the interdisciplinary problems, they originate from the academic movements and the scholarship, which is originating in disciplines outside your primary area of study, right? So, academic movement and the scholarship. So this can be intellectually stimulating kind of exercise. Interdisciplinary perspective, it becomes very intellectually stimulating. So a review of pertinent literature should include examining research from the related disciplines, right? And that can reveal new avenues of exploration and analysis. So an interdisciplinary approach in research, and particularly to selecting a research problem, offers an opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to the researcher to construct a more comprehensive understanding of a very complex issue that any single discipline may not be able to provide. So with UGCs and, across the world, with a lot of emphasis upon interdisciplinary perspectives, right? And of course, in literary studies, we are always literary studies are always proliferating in the interdisciplinary. If you look at the feminist theory, if you look at the gender studies, if you look at the cultural studies, if you look at this translation, language and culture, right? That how this historical and the cultural and the perspectives, they definitely shape the literature in many ways, right? Whether it is the, if it is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, that how that Narmada Bachao Andolan find its reflection in the kind of works which are produced by the writers, right? So it becomes a very, very stimulating kind of exercise for the research scholar. And definitely the scholar can draw inspiration from such kind of issues, such kind of activities, to look at the sorts of problems. Now then, interviewing practitioners, how you can identify your research problem about particular topic, and this can arise from the formal interviews or the informal discussions with the practitioners who provide you insights, various kinds of insights into new directions or the future research, how to make research, how to say, for example, you can conduct discussions with some specialist in the field, whether these are the teachers or the social workers or the healthcare providers or the lawyers or the rural folk, whether the farmers or men and women, right? So these real world problems, they can be studied, they can be studied, and they can definitely not be ignored, because always you are, when you are identifying your research problem, you are looking at the aspect that how it is shaping, it is giving a fresher perspective to a problem, right? So interviewing practitioner becomes one of the significant perspectives. It becomes one of the significant sources of identifying your research problem. And then, of course, your personal experience. Don't undervalue your everyday experience, what you are experiencing as a scholar, what you are encountering in your life. So do you think that it is worthwhile a problem for investigation? Think critically about your own experiences, about your own frustrations, if there are any, which you are facing as member of the society, or which you are facing as member of a community, of your neighborhood, of your family, or the personal life. So this can definitely be derived, for example, from a very deliberate observation of certain relationships, from where there can be no clear explanations, right? And then comes our relevant literature. This is what we are going to look at. So all these can be looked as the tools, right? All these are the, whether it is the deductions from the theory, whether it is interdisciplinary perspectives or interviewing practitioners or the personal experience. So all these factors or all these particular ways definitely facilitate how you might select a research problem and how you can build a research study out of that. Now comes the literature. So the selection of it, this is what most of the scholars actually of literary studies they do. But of course, in social sciences, they go into the personal experience or the interviewing practitioners primarily. As I said, interdisciplinarity is one of the thrust areas, right? So the selection of a research problem can be derived from a thorough review of the pertinent research. We always say that all research is based upon the previous research, right? So it is based upon a thorough review of pertinent research which is associated with your overall area of interest. So this may reveal that where the gaps exist in understanding a topic, that where are the gaps, and how are you going to fill in those gaps through your research, right? And wherein you definitely evaluate the methodologies. Of course, when you are conducting a kind of research literature review, so you are evaluating that if the methodologies which were employed in the prior studies can be adapted to solve the problem, right? or you determine if a similar study could be conducted in a very different subject area or applied in a different context or to different study sample, and that is different setting or different group of people. So the authors frequently conclude their studies because statements about further research can be valuable source for identifying new problems to investigate. So the fact that a researcher has identified a topic which is worthy of further exploration validates the fact that it is worth pursuing. So this fact cannot be underestimated, that once a researcher has identified a topic which is worthy of further exploration, so that definitely is validated. That validates the fact that whatever problem, so formulation of research questions or the research statement, one has to look at a very compelling topic. What I mean by compelling topic, that a good research problem or the statement begins by introducing the broad area in which your research is centered, right? A very compelling kind of topic, which of course the reader as well as the one who is involved in finds. So gradually it supports the multiple perspectives, leading the reader to a more specific issues you are investigating. So the statement, the research statement need not be very lengthy, right? But a good research problem should incorporate the various features. So let's look at a couple of research questions while you're formulating the research questions or you're looking at the research problem. So how, on your left side, the bad research questions are given. When I say bad, this means they are not properly drafted, right? So say, do women and nature share a moral connection, becomes a very, very colloquial and a very, very simpler way of putting things, right? And in what ways women nature connection influence lived experience of women becomes a much more appropriate, as far as the research question is concerned, right? Likewise, on the left side, if we have written, is environmental degradation due to capitalism? That's fine, it is written, but it could be written in a much better manner when we say that how does capitalist patriarchal framework affect environmental degradation, right? So all these exercises, when you are continuously involved in this process, you definitely enhance your research acumen. So have women been exploited and dominated by patriarchy as portrayed in fictional world of Shashi Deshpande? Right, so this is also one of the over-researched area. I have just taken an example, right? So here again, this is definitely not an appropriate research question. But then, when you reframe it and you put it like that to what extent oppression and exploitation of women gets reflected in the fictional world of Shashi Deshpande, right? So that becomes a much more appropriate research question. And how does this oppression find a reflection in literature and society? Right. So this is how, you can definitely evaluate your research questions, and you can definitely gauge for yourself that how your research question can be more appropriate. Right. Now, selecting a topic becomes a very, very difficult task, as I said earlier. Right. Whether you're looking at the social problem, whether it is the personal values of a researcher, whether these are the practical considerations, whether the sources of selection, is it the research which is conducted by others, which definitely comes by reviewing literature. I'm just, it's much more of repetitive in nature, what we have just talked about, the experience, the government priorities, the prevalent theories and imagination. Say, for example, I would like to give you an example of a book, Freedom and Destiny, Gender, Family and Popular Culture in India, by Patricia Oberoi, right? So in this particular book, Patricia Oberoi, the introductory chapter discusses the identification of the problem, right? And how does this problem was identified by Patricia Oberoi, right? So they say that, the problem for the observation of a statement on a bus, beautiful life, danger life. So, this is how normally on the buses such kind of statements are mentioned. Now, the question, the researcher has selected the question from this particular statement on a bus, right? The selection of a question is it a first-person account of a personal tragedy? Or it's the sorry account of a cuckolded husband? Or was it written as a warning? or any pavement graffiti, or was it an invitation to regard the fate of some luckless third person, a poor soul fallen victim to the beautiful wife, right? So these are some of the selection of questions which Patricia O'Brien had done, and this is how many a times any particular such kind of incidents triggers a thought in the mind, which is then carried forward as a research. Now, there are two types of, broadly speaking, there are two types of approaches to research, right? I'm sure you're all of you are aware of the fact that there is inductive and the deductive theory, right? So in the inductive approach, we are generating a new theory, whereas in the deductive approach, we are testing a theory, right? So in the inductive approach, the exploration, it explores new phenomena or the looks at previously researched phenomena from a different perspective, right? Whereas deductive, the emphasis is generally on causality. In inductive approach, it begins with a research question with narrow scope of study, whereas deductive approach begins with a hypothesis, wherein you are just hypothesizing that yes, these are the questions and these are the tentative answers to your questions. Inductive approach begins with the research questions to narrow scope of study, and it is associated with qualitative research, right? So in whereas deductive approach, it is associated with the quantitative research. So in literary studies, primarily, many times we are involved in the qualitative research, right, wherein we are exploring new phenomena, or we are looking at the previously researched phenomena from a different perspective, right? Say, for example, let us take the example of one such inductive approach. Say your observation is that crime against women is on the rise, right? So then you observe a pattern, or then you observe literature, that how literature reflects this crime against women, right? Or say one of the researchers here in the department is looking at that how women's writing depicts that suicide in literature, right? Or say how the Indian languages portray the caste class divide, right? So then you observe a pattern in the literature, that how the literature is reflecting that, and then you develop a theory, right? That how the 20th century, you are looking at the theory, you are testing it through the theory, that how 20th century fiction highlights the crime or prejudice against women. So this is how in the inductive approach you carry on the research. Whereas in deductive approach, you are testing the theories, you are starting with the theory, you are formulating a hypothesis which is based on the theory, you are collecting data to test the hypothesis, and you are analyzing the results, how data reject or support the hypothesis, right? Now, a quick comparison of the qualitative and the quantitative research. Whereas the qualitative research discover ideas with general research objectives, the research aspect is common, right? Whereas in quantitative research, it is testing the hypothesis or the specific research questions by conducting a kind of maybe a survey or sampling or whatever. Whereas in qualitative research, you are discovering the ideas with general research objects, you are observing and interpreting. It is much more free form, right? And whereas quantitative becomes a little more structured, because whatever approaches, whatever replies, whatever responses you receive through your data collection approach, you are dependent upon that, right? Research is intimately involved. Research is subjective. It is your own interpretation. So that definitely is there, that researcher has much more independence. Whereas in the quantitative research, the researcher is uninvolved, or researcher is more of an observer, because it is purely based upon the objectives which the researcher is receiving. In the qualitative approach, of course, there are smaller samples, often in natural setting, whereas in the quantitative approach, it is a larger samples to produce generalized results and the results that apply to other situation. Now, while developing a strong research question from your ideas, you should ask yourself these questions. Do I need the field and its literature well? What are the important research questions in my field? What areas need further exploration? Could my study fill a gap, lead to a greater understanding? Right? Has a great deal of research already been conducted in this topic or in this area? Has this study been done before? If so, is there a room for improvement? So these are actually the pertinent questions which every researcher has to ask himself or herself, because one point is cannot be denied that for any kind of research, it is always an individual journey. It is a solo journey wherein you have to sloth, right? And then, of course, you have to, of course, your supervisor is always there to guide you. But, these are some questions which you have to justify and answer throughout your life. So is the timing right for this question to be answered? Is this a hot topic or it's becoming obsolete? That's very, very important. Say, for example, if you take up, say the novels of Toni Morrison for that matter now, right? Or say the novels of Shashi Deshpande, and you are just conducting one research with the feminist study, that becomes absolutely obsolete, right? Likewise, if you are looking at Shashi Deshpande and comparing the vision of the writer with any other contemporary writer, so that becomes a little more interesting, right? That becomes a little more interesting. That does not sound obsolete because you are bringing about a comparative analysis, right? So would funding sources be available? If you are proposing a service program, is the largest community interested? Or then, will my study have a significant impact on the field? So all these are the significant questions which you must definitely ask yourself as you develop your research questions, right? Now, these are some of the ways many times while the students are formulating the research objectives. I'm talking primarily from the perspective of literary studies, of course, right? So, you definitely look at these aspects. Are you critically reviewing something? Are you identifying something? What are you going to investigate? Because it has to be very succinct. How you are discussing the implications, right? So these are some of the ways how you can make your research objectives very, very precise and to the point, succinct, clear, right? So formulating research objectives, you are critically reviewing, say, the Indian English drama concerning issues related to gender stereotypes, right? So you are critically reviewing the Indian English drama pertaining gender stereotypes. Then you are identifying how gender stereotypes are a major thematic concerns of Mahesh Dattani. Within that, then you are narrowing it down gradually. Then you investigate the concerns of Mahesh Dattani regarding stereotyping. And then you discuss the implications of such societal attitudes and make findings and recommendations to policymakers. This becomes very, very important. This is where, at the fourth point, most of the research scholars, they get a little sloppy, weak, right? They fumble. They cannot make such kind of, recommendations which makes our research more relevant, right? So in literary studies, it's very important, as we understand that, of course, literature is always produced in it is always shaped by various social, political, historical, and cultural forces, right? That what the writer is depicting, how you can, based upon that, make some findings and recommendations, right? Now, coming over to literature review, what we understand by literature review, it's a survey of scholarly sources on a specific topic, right? It provides an overview of current knowledge, allowing you to identify relevant theories, methods, and gaps in the existing research. So this is how we define literature review. It's a survey of scholarly sources on a specific topic. And it provides you an overview of what is the kind of knowledge which is already existing in the area you wish to undertake, right? It involves finding the relevant publications such as books, journals, and articles. And it involves, this is very, very important, critically analyzing them and explaining what you found. There are 5 key steps, in literature review. Number 1 step is search for a relevant literature. You are searching a relevant literature. You evaluate sources. You identify the themes and debates and gaps. This is online, outline the structure, and then you write your literature review. This is important. Many times what I've observed is scholars, they just condense, they just jot it down. So and so has conducted a research on this particular aspect. So and so has in this book has written this thing, right? So the scholars, they are just writing all these points, but when it comes over to writing your own literature review, it is just giving your own critical analysis, that what have you understood from what the other scholars have, right? So you don't have to just summarize the sources. It analyzes, synthesizes, and critically evaluates to give a clear picture of the state of knowledge. So this is very important. There are, say, approximately 20 to 25, say, sometimes, scholars, they get very, very over ambitious, and they take up a research wherein there is a very limited literature available, right? So it becomes a little more challenging, right? So the job of the literature review while you're conducting literature review is that you don't have to just summarize the sources, you have to analyze them, you have to synthesize them, you have to critically evaluate them to give a very clear picture of the state of knowledge on the subject. This means that you should be able to identify what has been established, what has been discredited and accepted in your field, and what are the areas of controversy or conflict among different scholars. Right now, one point is very, very significant to understand, that nowhere the literature review, you should always avoid to reinvent the wheel. This is very, very important. Many times, scholars, I'm sure there have been some sessions on plagiarism and the research ethics, particularly with the advent of a lot of this digital revolution. What we see is that many times scholars, they are just plagiarizing. So research ethics is one of the growing and emerging concerns, right? So you have to give credits to the previous researcher. And of course, you have to demonstrate your knowledge of the research problem. You have to demonstrate your understanding of the theoretical and research issues related to your research problem. You should be able to critically evaluate relevant literature and to integrate and synthesize the existing literature. This is very important. So these points are always to be kept in mind, that literature review, is not only reinventing the wheel, it is much more over providing new theoretical insights or developing a new model as a conceptual framework for your research. Right now, this particular I think inverted pyramid brings things very clearer to you, right? That how you have to narrow down. So this particular design helps us to understand, helps us to think of the organization of a good literature review as an inverse triangle, right? After first establishing the seminal theories and the foundational research that inform your approach and topic, you narrow down your discussion to focus on the specific studies and methodologies that justify your research gap and design, right? So you begin with a theoretical foundation for your research, and then you carry out the studies that are generally related, broader history of topic in your field, right? And then you look at the studies that are similar to yours, similar topic, population, research design, right? And then finally, you move on to your own topic as an authority, right? So this inverse triangle definitely gives you the complete understanding. This, you should always keep this inverse triangle in your mind as you undertake your research, that yes, this is what actually my research, my literature review should aim at, should look at, building with the theoretical foundation, coming over to the broader history of the topic in my field, and then the studies that are very similar to that of mine and how my research is different from them, right? And then, of course, you move towards the research gap. And once you have identified the research gap, then obviously you have undertaken, you have, boarded in the right bus, right? So role of reading and writing in the process of thesis is worth mentioning. It's very, very significant because, I have been talking about the fact that how you have to develop critical thinking, how you have to develop that kind of understanding, right? So reading definitely gives knowledge and enriches the horizon of research scholar. But does writing not do the same? So this is the question which I pose to all the research scholars, because reading is generally synonymous with the attainment of knowledge, with exploring the benefits of intensive and very extensive kind of writing, right? But the gap which I have identified is that many times scholars, they are so much involved in the process of reading that the writing takes a back seat, right? So the reading is thus taken at the cost of practicing writing by research scholars. So what scholars actually do, this all of you need to reflect over it very, very seriously, right? So how you can maintain that balance between reading and writing. Writing happens only through writing and not through reading. But what scholars actually do is that they are most of the time reading, and that affects their writing to a great deal. And towards the end, so researcher must explore his or her writing competence by getting down to write draft after draft. Most of the initial writings may not be of much use for the thesis, yet command on writing cannot be acquired by going through this process. So how you can acquire that command, that is only through the process of continuous writing, preparing various drafts, right? So if a researcher chooses to straight away write the actual thesis without practicing to write, the thesis written will be equivalent to those redundant pieces that never came out of his or her mind. So many times researchers are involved in this exercise that yes, we are reading, and how they are actually able to organize their thoughts and put them on the paper, there appears a big gap. So such kind of thesis wherein there has not been a balance between the reading and writing, such thesis, despite the best of priming and pruning, remain half-baked piece without written with no competence. Therefore, a researcher must avoid all reading and no writing. I tell my scholars many times, 4 years of reading and 1 year of writing, right? So, in this 4 years of reading and 1 year of writing, of course, you can very well navigate, you can very well understand that how beneficial it would be to the researcher, how good it would be as a piece of research wherein the scholar has just put in 1 year of writing, right? These are some of the common mistakes which a scholar must always avoid, wherein a research proposal or a research thesis must be focused, and it should not be all over the map or diverge onto the unrelated tangents without a clear sense of purpose. So it should be much more focused. And of course, many times some works, they fail to cite the landmark works in your literature review. So any kind of research should be grounded in the foundational research that lays the foundation for understanding, right? Say, for example, if I give you the example of say again ecofeminism for that matter, right? So recently we are just doing a couple of things in that area, right? So if you are looking at the post-colonial ecofeminism and you mention Vandana Shiva and you do not mention Beena Agarwal, right? That how Beena Agarwal, she refutes the stance of Vandana Shiva, wherein she says that Vandana Shiva, her theorization lacks the issues pertaining the issues of caste, class, in the third world countries, right? So such kind of foundational research which is there, it cannot be overlooked at any cost, right? So thereafter, the failure to delimit the contextual boundaries of your research, for example, time, place, and people. As with any research paper, your proposed study must inform the researcher how and in what ways the study will examine the problem. So examining the problem becomes very, very, because as I said right in the beginning, that any kind of research which you undertake, it is basically answering some questions, right? So you are finding some tentative answers to the questions, right? So these frequently committed errors should always be omitted in any kind of research. First is to failure to develop a coherent and persuasive argument for the proposed research. So this is much more critical. In many workplace settings, the research proposals or the synopsis is intended to argue for why a study should be funded, right? So sloppy or imprecise writing or the poor grammar, as everyone knows that this is absolutely not at all accepted in any kind of research work, and too much of detail on the minor issues and not enough detail on the major issues is another important point which any researcher should always try to avoid. So to conclude, my dear students, research, of course, is a painstaking job. You have to, slog, and, take it if you possess passion and zeal to discharge it. So as I said right in the beginning, that there is no elevator. I began with that particular picture. So there is no elevator to success. You have to take the stairs. So the stairs are there. It has to be very systematic, starting with your research problem, research questions, and moving on to the significance of the your literature review, right? So any questions? Any questions are welcome now.
If anything, you may either write it in the chat box or raise your hands.
Okay, there must be some questions in the chat box.
Okay, ma'am. Mr. You may please question is, you may put your microphone on. Go ahead.
A.K. Parihar.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. My question is, as we have said, the discussion of literary review with a very coherent manner. But my point is, ma'am, is it necessary to include those theoretical bases which we often use as a theoretical framework in our later chapters discussion? I hope you're getting my point. Suppose if I'm analyzing a particular literary text in chapter 2nd or chapter 3rd, so while I try to focus on the issue which I try to delve into, so is it necessary to include the critical remarks of the theorists or the critics to justify my point of view? Or I can remain intact with my own critical thinking and assessment of the literary text?
Parihar, actually, perhaps you are trying to, it's a very good question. I'm glad you asked this question. Now, my advice to you, what I'm trying to highlight is that in literature review, if you remember, in literature review, you are basically conducting a review of the research which is conducted. Say, for example, let's take the example of the fictional world of Kamila Shamsi, right? So, how Kamila Shamsi, she deals with the concept of nation in her novels. Let's take this example, right? How she takes up the issue of nation, gender, all these aspects she's taking up in her novels. Now, my job as a scholar would be, first of all, to identify that what is the kind of work which has been carried on Kamila Shamsi's fictional work, right? Is it say 5 to 6 novels which have been taken up by the scholar, and which perspective? Maybe some scholars, they have taken up the gender aspect, some scholars have taken up the portrayal of women or the subjugation of women, or some scholars, they might have taken up the question pertaining how Kamila Shamsi, she looks at nation as a third space, right? Somebody might have taken up, say, Marxist perspective of Kamila Shamsi's novels, right? So all these, say A, B, C, they have looked at the novels of Kamila Shamsi's from 3 perspectives, right? All these 3 you are, putting across, you are condensing, you are evaluating that these ABC 3 scholars, they have looked at the works of Kamila Shamsi. Of course, in literature review, it will go up to approximately 15 to 20, right? So you will just put across that, yes, in the year 2000, so and so scholar made this study in 2001, so and so scholar made this study in 2005, so and so made this study in 1997, somebody made this study, then in 2020, Gulam made this study, for example, right? That how you are trying to look at it, you are just trying to find out that yes, nobody had looked at the intersection of nature and women in the fictional world of Kamila Shamsi. So my job would be, this is one gap which I have identified, and I'm going to look at it from this framework, right? So this is entirely 2 to 3 chapters of your thesis. Sorry, 2 to 3 pages of your thesis are devoted to review. At the most 3 to 4. It depends how you are condensing, how much exhaustive literature review you are conducting in your introduction, right? So what you are going to talk about in your chapterization, that becomes a later on, exercise. That's nowhere mentioned in the review of literature. Remember that inverse triangle, right? You remember that inverse triangle. Then you are identifying the gap.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much.
That was very good.
Krishna Kumar.
Ma'am, he wants to ask something. Krishna Kumar, you may open your mic.
Good afternoon, madam. Very glad to ask the questions to you. Are you hear my voice, madam?
Yeah, I can. There is slight disturbance, but I think I should be able to figure out. Yeah, please.
Okay. But my question is, why I should include the review of literature in the thesis work? So already I mentioned all the details in bibliography, even though why I should include all the things in the review of literature. That is my question.
Okay. Your question is, I just repeated, your question is that why should I give review of literature when everything is already mentioned in the bibliography, right? Have I taken your question right, Mr. Krishna Kumar? Yeah.
Madam, my question is, why I should include it in the thesis work review of literature?
Okay.
Because all the information we are mentioned in the bibliography.
Okay.
Even though we are included all the information in the
No, but then how will you...
Okay, please.
Yeah, I got your question. That, you are already mentioning in the bibliography, right? Ma'am, if possible, stop the presentation screen. It's creating confusion. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, your question is, pertaining the fact that, of course, once we are already documenting that in the bibliography, then there is no need to give the literature review. But how are you going to identify the research gap then? Maybe you are conducting a research on, say, the dialectics of tradition and modernity in the works of Gugi wa Thiong'o, right? Okay, you are thinking that, okay, I would like to look at how in the African literature, the writers, there is the interplay of tradition and modernity in the novels of Gugi wa Thiong'o. And I have also conducted the same kind of research, right? Then what is new about your and my work, right? So it's the basic thing. You begin with evaluating, reviewing the existing research, because one thing is very, very important in research. We say that all research is built upon previous research. This is one mantra. This is one basic mantra of research. All research is built upon previous research. We look at other researchers and then we identify the gap. Bibliography is a separate thing, the kind of works whom you are quoting and citing during the process of your research. For building your argument, you have to look at the previous research and then only you can identify the research gap. Isn't it?
Thank you. Very nice answer, madam. Thank you.
I hope the question is well addressed. Now we have another question, and we shall try to address every question very briefly, ma'am, since we are going to start with another session. Thank you, ma'am. Umar Haider writes, thank you, ma'am, for the illuminating lecture. My question is how post 9/11 fiction can be analyzed using post-colonial approach?
Yeah, good question. I'm glad. Just a minute. Can I? Okay. Could you please repeat that? How post 9/11 fiction could be?
Can be analyzed using post-colonial approach.
Post-colonial approach. Yeah, it's very interesting topic. Why not? Herein, of course, whosoever was asking this question, that obviously, first of all, why not? You can look at it from various perspectives. The interplay of the power dynamics which are there in the world, right? So you'll have to first of all look at the post-colonial theory, right? You have to conduct a kind of survey the existing corpus, right, which of course is a very very timely and interesting topic, which of course the scholars, they are carrying on various kinds of research also in this area, right? So definitely for carrying over this research, my dear student, whosoever was asking this question, what you can do is that first of all you can this is one idea, I mean, which has perhaps occurred in your mind, or you are already conducting your research in this area, right? That would be wonderful. So in view of the contemporary nature of this research, you can definitely first of all look at the kind of research which has been carried on, and then you can justify your own viewpoint vis-a-vis post-colonial theory. Why not? It can be conducted.
Thank you, ma'am. I guess if there is any question, you may raise your hand or write here. But anyway, we
Okay,
don't have any questions, any more questions. Now, since we are already running out of time, we shall straight away begin with the second session. And I must thank Dr. Vandana Sharma once again. Uh, with this, let me wind this session up. And thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being with us and sharing such insightful ideas. And this presentation was very, very handy. It was simple to understand. And so enjoying this presentation. It was a wonderful working session. I'm sure it was too helpful to all the scholars and must announce that all being broadcast on YouTube Live. You can also find them later on. There's no need to worry about collect. So
thank you.
thank you, ma'am.
I leave
Thank you.
Dr. Nasir. Thank you very much. And my best wishes to all the participants.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay. Dear, we shall now begin with the second session of the day without any break, because we are already out of time, and Professor is already waiting for us. And we today have with us our esteemed resource person, Dr. Narendra Kumar, who will be delivering his lecture on framing effective research proposals, content and structure. I feel both humbled and proud. Dr. Narendra Kumar, can you hear me? Okay, you are here already, sir. Thank you, sir. So I feel
thank you.
I feel both humbled and proud today to introduce a professor who has been my teacher at the University of Jammu and whom I admire for his sincerity and steadfastness. Dr. Kumar is an associate professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences and in charge Dean Academic Affairs, LNM Institute of Information Technology, Dept. Narendra Kumar context literature of the Caribbean, Africa, adaptees, and Dr. Kumar has been teaching courses in English language, literature, adaptation, and contemporary theory at undergraduate and postgraduate levels since 2004. A PhD on Carol Phillips with specific reference post-colonial problematics of race, ethnicity, and history. He has forayed into South Asian literature concerning post-colonial effect in the region through a major project sponsored by Indian Council of Social Science Research, New Delhi. He has presented and published papers in the areas of post-colonial literature, ethnic conflict, and South Asian literature with various international publishers. I, Dr. Nasir Farid Bhatt, Assistant Professor of Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, NIT Srinagar, and convener of this workshop, once again Thank you, sir. And I extend my warm welcome to Dr. Narendra Kumar. Welcome, sir. With your permission, I request you, sir, to please commence the lecture. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nasir, for a very generous introduction. I hope I am audible to all.
Always welcome.
Okay. So, if I'm audible, let me start where the previous session ended. I could attend part of it, at least the Q&A part of it. And let me begin with the question. How many of us have read a text by T.S. Eliot, which is called Tradition and Individual Talent? You can just raise your hand so that I know that how many of us have read. Okay. So a good number of us have read that text. Yeah. So that's a good thing. So all right. So many of us have read the text, and that's a good thing, because what Dr. Vandana was trying to say, and that's where I would want to begin, is that as a researcher, we have to place ourselves in the tradition of researchers. So as T.S. Eliot says, that even if a writer is writing something new, still the person is a part of the tradition. Tradition cannot, a person cannot separate oneself from the tradition. The similar thing happens in a research, whether it is a PhD research or otherwise, because research is a kind of continuity. Even if one can say that it is disruptive, but it is not de-linked from what happened earlier, right? So, for instance, if you take the example from the field of science, so when Newton came up with the laws of Newton, they were the prevalent forces guiding research in physics. And as soon as Einstein came on the scene, it became more Einsteinian. But the thing is that still there was no break. So still people study Newtonian laws, even those who do research on a specific relativity or generic relativity. So the point is that we are all a part of a tradition, and we continue in that tradition. So all new research comes out of the old research. There is a kind of tradition of critiquing the old things, and then new things emerge. So even if the research or new research is disruptive, it is not de-linked from what has happened previously. So in light of this, let me tell you certain things about how do we frame effective research proposals, what could be the content and structure. It is going to be more mundane kind of thing, and there can be a lot of repetition as well, because you've done so many things already which are going to be a part of this presentation. So I'll try to brush through what we have done. One thing I would say is that in case you have any question in between, the chat box is open. So you can either write it in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand and start speaking. I don't mind people disrupting the session for asking questions, because questions add to the flow of the class in my case. So I'll be fine with that. And I would be happy to answer questions whenever they emerge. So moving on with a simple thing that you may have done a number of times over the period of 4 days now. What is research? So it's a kind of inquiry which is organized, systematic, and logical. And this inquiry is based on available sources. So they can be empirical sources. For instance, people who do quantitative research, for instance, they base it on the surveys, for instance, or questionnaires distributed. When it comes to qualitative research or literary research, then it can be the available data could be the literary text or the theoretical framework that we frame for testing something or for bringing out new knowledge or contribute to the existing paradigm of knowledge. And that's how research actually continues. So I took this from Keith F. Punch, who has written a book on how to frame good research proposal. Now, in a good research proposal, what we try to do, what are the crux of the things? The first thing that we want to state is that what that study is going to be about. What do we want to do in that particular study? Second thing that is going to be there is how we are going to achieve that, how we are going to do it, and why we want to do that kind of study. What is the worth? How it is going to help that discipline in a way, or is it going to help the humanity in some way, or is it going to contribute to new knowledge that emerges in a particular area? So the contribution may be of any nature, but it has to be placed why it is important, what kind of conceptual enriching your research is going to do to particular domain or particular area. So these are the things which broadly cover a research proposal. I'll give you specifics very soon. Now, a research proposal is an important document for anybody who is attempting to undertake a study. And why it is important? Because that is the only opportunity a student may have, because in some cases when we present a proposal, we even are not invited for making a presentation. In the case of students or PhD researchers, generally it happens. But for instance, if you are applying for research funding, so when I applied for my ICSSR project, I was not called for interview. So I did not have the opportunity to present the proposal. I had just one opportunity, and that was to send them the proposal. And the decision was to be made based on what I had written there. Right? So it's an opportunity that we should seriously undertake. We should place the things precisely and thoroughly. Number two, why it is important? Because it reflects on whether such a kind of study is feasible, right? And that feasibility will come from how you have presented the things, plus how you have put up the literature survey, how much of background you have covered in the proposal document. So all that is going to be significant. And number two that it reflects is whether you are prepared to undertake that study. Right. So when you do literature survey, particularly as Dr. Bandana was talking about, that literature survey also reflects whether you have done enough background study to undertake that particular study. Right. So the funding agency, for instance, or an institution which approves of a research proposal would want to see whether you are going in the right direction, you're undertaking, whether you are not overstating the things or understating, whether the proposal is too narrow or too broad, because in both the cases there could be problems. Now let me show you some sample guidelines which institutions have put up, and that's where we'll begin our discussion or build on our discussion on. They are the real cases, and I've taken three for our understanding. And what I'm trying to do in this presentation of mine is to deal less with the theoretical things or less with the how research proposal broadly can be written, but I'm more going to share my own personal experience in putting up the research proposals and how I built on the things, how I came up with title and what I did for literature survey and how things moved on actually, and what has been my experiences as a student of English literature, right? Because there can be differences in different disciplines. So when you say undertake something from engineering, it might be a lot different, right? So we are placed in technical institutions, and that's where we face a little bit of challenge also, because the dominant forces in technical institutions, even in funding agencies at times, are people coming from science and technology, and they understand the research in a different manner, or they look at it in, with a different perspective altogether. So let me begin with the first one, which comes from the University of Westminster. And these are the broad areas that a person needs to cover. This is how it says. It gives you complete, clear guidelines how you have to prepare the research proposal. So there is going to be a title, for instance. You have to talk about the background and the rationale, why that particular study is important, what work has already happened, what are the gaps. So that's where the literature survey comes into being, right? The research questions that you want to explore, whether you want to have specific questions or you want to have it in the form of a hypothesis. Hypothesis is going to be more in the case of, for instance, science and technology, where they have something to test, right? Because they look for gaps in the previous research, and they want to then have hypothesis built up based on what has happened earlier, based on their own pilot studies, and then they want to test that particular hypothesis. Otherwise, in literature, that we come from, the field of English studies, it is in general, or field of humanities. Humanities can still differ a little bit because philosophy has that scientific bent, but literary studies in particular, they may not have that clear-cut hypothesis. But research questions, yeah. Anything from anybody? Okay. So research questions, research methodology, and then plan of work, and a brief bibliography. And we'll deal with each of these in little detail. The second one that I wanted to show you, and what you'll see is that more or less they are similar with a little bit of difference of wording here and there. So for instance, this comes from University of Birmingham, and the first one, in the previous case, they put up as research title. Here it is research topic, then review of literature. So rather than putting the broad thing, which is the background or rationale for background, they have given the review of literature straight, and then research objectives, which will include your hypothesis or research questions or the proposition that you're making in your proposal, or the problem that you want to explore and find a solution for. Your own research methodology, research strategy, and then anticipated results can happen more in the field of science and technology, or in the case of some social sciences, which is more data centric. So for instance, if there is an empirical study in psychology, you can find this kind of thing there. And then in these universities where you are also looking for some kind of funding or some kind of fellowship, they would certainly want to know your plan, how much time you are going to take, and and what are you going to do within what timeline. So for instance, in the case of universities in general in India, or the ones that I'm aware of, you may not be required to provide the timelines. But in the case of universities where funding is crucial, and they want to know for a particular period of time you're going to get funding, then they would certainly also want to know the timeline that you're going to undertake. So for instance, in the case of our institution, we don't take it in writing, but each student is supposed to present the work every 6 months and give a timeline of what the person is going to do next, right? And so if funding is available for 4 and 5 years, we would want to have the entire plan for 4 to 5 years, in which the person is going to finish the thing. The similar is the case with the funding agencies, for instance. So funding agencies, if they are giving you money for 2 years, or they want the research to be completed in 2 years, they would want to have 6 monthly plan for the research work. So what duration of time you're going to take in data collection, and what duration is going to go into the analysis of data, and then when you're going to write the final thesis or final report, right? So for instance, if it is 2 years, you may maximum take 1 year for data collection or doing the literary text study or field work, and then you start analyzing the things and all. And then finally, references and bibliography, which are the significant part of any proposal. I'll come to ICSSR a little bit later, where things are more or less the same, except the ones I said that since it involves funding as well, so they would want to have yearly report to be sent to them. They also want to have clear timelines and so associated things there. Now, beginning with the first thing that is important and that comes up to us is the title of the thesis. How do you figure out? How do you reach that level actually where you can fix up a title? Because that's one of the significant things. And why it is significant also because in general, once the title is fixed, we possibly cannot change it for the entire duration. And one slip there can make our life hell, because we have to write everything within that framework of the title. So when I did my PhD research, I had certain stages in reaching the title. So the first thing that we decided was that we are going to have a broad area of study. So we fixed up on post-colonial studies. So I like the area. And that's why me and my supervisor, we together decided that we are going to do something in post-colonial study. remember, when you decide your research area, it should be something with which you can live for a good number of years, right? And that means that should be close to your heart. If you are choosing something which you have no liking for, the PhD journey itself may become cumbersome. So have something which you like, in which you can invest your 4 or 5 years at least, because that is how long the PhD is going to go. And if you can spend longer, nothing like it. So choose a research area carefully. And once that was decided, then we had to look for an author, and we figured out that I'm going to take up Carol Phillips. I read a couple of books by him before deciding whether I'm going to actually work on him, because unless I like the writer, I possibly may not be able to work on that particular work. And then I liked certain things about him. So one of the things I liked was I read a book by him, for example. The title of the book was The Nature of Blood. And the thing that I liked about The Nature of Blood was that it is polyphonic. There were so many narrative voices, and there was engagement with history. There was engagement with the Holocaust. There was engagement with slavery. So multiple strands coming together and making it a complex thing. And so my decision was made that I'm going to take up this. And once that was done, I had to go through a couple of papers, reviews. So papers on Carol Phillips, for instance, reviews of his novels, what they are about. And I had read at least half of the novels written by him, so that I know a bit of the primary text at least. Once that was done, we looked for the prominent things that were coming. So as I said, that it was about slavery that he talks about. It was slave trade, problems with the immigrants, racism. So the word race was taken in. And then the next thing was that since it is also about the Holocaust, what do we take up as a generic term so that we can include his work on Holocaust? And that's where ethnicity came into being, right? So we made the general distinction between the race and ethnicity is that race generally people place in biological markers, whereas ethnicity has only cultural differences. Although I would say that race itself is a social construct, right? So that's what you get to know when you do literature survey. And then history or engagement with history was there in him, because he talks about the Holocaust. That was one part, but he also talks about the situation of Jews before the Holocaust and how you see the repetition of things happening. And the second thing about history is that he also revisits, for instance, Othello. So in Nature of Blood, he's rewriting Othello, and there is a kind of revisiting of the entire narrative. He, for instance, gives Othello a past. He said that if he had a family back home, if he comes from a royal family, what kind of feelings he would have, how would he find himself placed in a white society which is more colonial, and there is a kind of colonial neurosis that it is going to go through. So it becomes a complex thing and a different text altogether, and all that coming together. And so that's where then I started forming my research questions, right? So within the framework of the post-colonial theory, what kind of questions I'm going to ask about these three terms? How am I going to build up an argument associating these three terms, right? And what are going to be the specific questions about Carol Phillips and his writings? Data collection in this case is the literary text plus the work done on Carol Phillips, the texts that talk about the theoretical framework for post-colonial studies. But when you do post-colonial studies, you also have to have good grounding in, say, post-structuralism, Marxism, because post-colonialism gets informed by these theories quite a bit. So all that was done. And once that was done, the final title was decided. And finally, we began with the tentative title, which was Race, Ethnicity, and History in Carol Phillips. But we finally fixed up the title as Race, Ethnicity, and History, Post-Colonial Interrogations in the Fiction of Carol Phillips. So that was the journey which I had to undertake in coming up with a title for my PhD thesis along with my supervisor. Second one was for my ICSSR project. So I had to handle it all alone. But this thing was a result of a longer journey in the sense that my PhD journey was inbuilt in this. So I for instance, read Mina Alexander's fault lines, and the thing stuck with me that fault line has to be used in some way when I talk about ethnic conflict in the Indian subcontinent, right? The idea of doing a project on Indian subcontinent and ethnic conflict came to me when I was placed in Jammu and Kashmir. I was there at Badr campus for 2.5 years, campus of the University of Jammu. I wanted to understand the place, and one of the ways of understanding the place is through its narratives. Once I started opening up the literature of J&K and the contemporary voices, I was tempted to see how or what kind of things have been written in the neighboring countries. So from Kashmir, I moved to, say, Pakistan, and then Afghanistan, and literary voices emerging from there. And then I expanded the things to the Indian subcontinent. So I also took in Bangladesh because I can't leave it out, and then Sri Lanka. And there was one thing, that something was happening here during 1940s. So 1947, 48, these countries were becoming independent. And then there were certain things happening during 1980s. And 1980s, people also see a kind of start for proper post-colonial writing. So particularly in India, for instance, because that was the time when Midnight Children was published. And that is seen as a kind of groundbreaking work when we talk about post-colonial Indian literature. So the origin of that title was informed by one thing, that this journey I was undertaking. The second thing that I had to also consider was that I was applying, being a literature student, I was applying to Council for Social Science Research. So I had to also connect it with social sciences, right? And for that, I had to include many people who come from sociology, psychology, international relations. And plus, I had to present the proposal in such a way that it looks interdisciplinary. So my primary text is going to come from literature, but the theoretical framework is going to be informed by social sciences. And it was on that ground that it got accepted, right? So, and the fact remains about literary studies is that it invariably has to be placed in social sciences or other humanities subjects. I don't know the reason, possibly because literary studies in the current fashion, they started happening much later, or the universities adopted the teaching of English literature much later. Remember, English literature was introduced first in India as a kind of colonial intervention, right? I think in Presidency College, Calcutta, possibly that was the first place where it was introduced, and England took it much later. So research in this field started happening much later, whereas social sciences had fixed tools and frameworks to do research. Now, much of the research which is happening in literary studies is more informed by the concepts and principles and theoretical frameworks that are emerging in other areas. That can be philosophy or even history or sociology, anthropology, and fields like that. So my primary text came from literature. I associated it with social sciences, and that's how the entire title came into being. And that's where the part which is after the colon came into being, narrative as a socio-political discourse. And so your title actually has to be, or should, ultimately has to give a broad picture of what you're going to do, or what are the things that you're going to fit in. And if it is generic enough and broad enough, it'll help you. It'll provide you enough elbow room to carry out your research. So moving on from the title and looking at the background of rationale, that's where you have literature review as well, or literature survey as well. So you have to give the background. So for instance, when I was doing this, the first project of mine, which was, so I had to talk about post-colonialism quite a bit. I had to give the entire background of race, ethnicity, and history, how they become prominent issues for post-colonial studies. How do you relate race and ethnicity? What are the differences? How people started not using race because it became a pejorative term because of its association with slavery and slave trade, and the term ethnicity came into being as much accepted a term. And when was it that even ethnicity became a problematic term? Because initially, if you see something as a kind of cultural categorizer or something which is classifying something cultural, it's fine. But it starts becoming a problematic thing when it becomes a center of power. And there was a time when it became associated with the Holocaust. That's where you see white people discriminating against white people. So it was kind of ethnic thing. And then its association with ethno-nation. And that's where when you look at all these things together, you actually start putting in the background. Once that is done, then you move to, excuse me, just a second. I'm sorry, there was an interruption. Any questions at this stage? Or I can move on? Anybody? Okay, so once the background or introductory part is done, then you have to give a short literature survey. Now, what do we do when we do literary studies? It is easier to give the literature survey in the case of subjects or proposals which come from, say, sciences and technology. Even in social sciences, it is much easier than we talk about literary studies. And why it is slightly different in the case of literary studies is because you not only have to talk about the area that you're undertaking. So for instance, post-colonial studies that I took, or somebody takes eco-criticism, for instance, he has to talk about it and he has to problematize the area through the literature survey, right? But also have to locate the author amongst the contemporaries and talk about what has been happening before the author came on the scene. You have to locate, or you have to place the author also within the tradition of authors of similar writing, right? So what were the contemporaries doing and what was happening before him? So if you are doing something on, say, on African literature, you have to go back until at least Chinua Achebe, if not slightly before him, right? So that you can place the entire tradition there. I was dealing with Caribbean, so I had to take up the previous generation of Caribbean writers also to place Carol Phillips in the tradition of that. And then I had to talk about the contemporaries or contemporary Caribbean British writers of Carol Phillips. So that's where, and then literature survey has to be complete in the sense that you have to talk about what has been happening recently, right? So you have to take into consideration the key developments and debates that are happening currently, because that's where you are going to find your own space, and you're going to create something which is going to be interesting for other people, because ultimately your job is to further the research that has happened in a particular area. And then so you have to place the author among the contemporaries. So after this background or rationale, you need to move to the research objectives. That's where your research questions, your hypothesis come into being. So as I said that in the case of literary studies, it's still, I mean, people find it difficult to go with a clear-cut hypothesis. It is possible to give a clear-cut hypothesis in the case of science and technology, but social sciences and literary studies, hypothesis emerges as the work proceeds. And when you start clearly seeing this scenario, when you have actually delved quite a bit in your research work, so it may emerge in the work proper, may not emerge in the proposal itself. But research questions certainly be there. So you have to have one or two main research questions and then associated supplementary research questions, some kind of generic research questions and some sort of specific research questions, particularly to the theoretical framework that you're undertaking, plus the author or the authors that you're undertaking for your study. You have to define the problem statement. Again, it's same as hypothesis or something like that. So there are going to be disciplinary differences here, and the place is actually slightly loosely built around. So when you do literary studies, you have to handle that flexibility and looseness as well. Now we come to the next part, which is the research strategy or methodology. How you're going to work around the things. And that's where I saw a clear difference when I was, for example, working for the project of the ICSSR, where they wanted me to be more particular about the research methodology, because the focus of the council was on social science subjects more. And that's where they wanted clearly written research methodology, and I had to give them specific timelines, how I'm going to work around, what is going to be my primary data, how it is going to be extracted, and how then it is going to be related to the secondary data that is going to come from the commentaries or the theoretical books coming from on ethnicity or ethnic conflict or nationalism, things like that. So quite a bit had to be worked out here, which was not that complicated when I was working on the PhD research proposal. But you have to give a tentative methodology, particularly how your resources are going to be drawn, primary sources are going to be drawn, secondary sources, theoretical framework. And if you're dealing with, say, quantitative research, then it becomes also about data collection. So, for instance, if you're doing, say, surveys, sending out questionnaires, whether you're doing a pilot study beforehand, and based on that, you're framing your questionnaires. And then once your data is collected, what you're going to do with that data, how you're going to validate that data. After validation, how you are going to analyze and what tools you are going to use for analysis of it, which in the case of literary studies, your primary data source is going to be the literary text, which is going to be seen in the light of the theoretical framework that you have created, particularly in the when you do your first chapter, which is the introductory one, you talk about the theoretical framework and you fit in everything there accordingly. And you also need to give a kind of tentative chapterization. And what I'm saying is that the job of the proposal is actually to reflect whether you have the understanding of carrying out that research work, right? It's not that everything that is written in the proposal is going to go in the same manner. There is a lot that changes when you undertake the journey. The real journey can be quite different. I had a talk with a friend of mine when I was applying for the proposal, and he said that, look, when you write a proposal, the regulatory agency has one way. So you say that you are going to move from point 1 to point 2. And that's how they want it. But when you do it really, nobody bothers how you are reaching the point B from point A. Right, so they'll say that you give a clear timeline, for instance. So you say that first 6 months you are collecting the data for your theoretical framework, you're creating a kind of model. Next 6 months you take for doing a kind of field study, you're going to talk to people, take interviews and things like that. And then you start analyzing data. That does not happen actually in the real research. You may start analyzing the data as you go along with the collection and all. So things start coming in, you start writing certain things at the same time, right? So proposal and then, for instance, tentative chapterization, what you find is that something is more compelling when you're going for the real research. You change the chapters also. That's why they are tentative only. You don't give fixed nomenclatures of the chapters there, but you have to present that you actually are in know of how it is going to be done, right? So all this remains tentative that way. Schedule and budget, as I said, that is more important in the case of funding, but it is also important for the regular PhD work, because you have fixed time limit, right? And you have to complete it within that particular time limit only. You can't exceed, right? So for instance, in general, it is coursework plus 3 and 1, 4 years you can take. So 3 years for doing the actual research, 1 year for coursework, and then 1 year for writing the thesis, editing it, getting different drafts done, and it is over. Part-time research, it can, but these things vary from institution to institution, right? And particularly when you're on fellowship, these things are a little more watertight, because they want to know your, so for instance, as I said, in our case, every 6 months there is a review, and that happens in the case of IITs. I'm not sure whether NIT Srinagar is following that. Most likely they must be following 6 monthly reviews. You have a doctoral review committee, and that review committee sits every 6 months to see the progress. In the case of projects, timelines are 2 to 3 years. So for me, for instance, it was 2 years plus 6 months. 2 years I had to complete the work. 6 months I had to prepare the report and submit it. And all this has to be given. And then you have to put in at the end of the document the references and bibliography. So references of the work cited in the proposal, plus a tentative working bibliography that makes the regulatory agency or funding agency or the institutions to see that you have enough background understanding of carrying out that particular work. You know what are the sources, or what are the possible sources which you are going to use for your study. So primary texts or primary sources, secondary sources for literature students in particular. And when you put up secondary sources, there is a practice, some people place the things separately. So books separately, book chapters and articles or research papers separately. Some club them together and they are alphabetically placed. And then these are the popular style sheets or handbooks that people use. So for documentation, so MLA style sheet, for instance, in our case, we use all three. So MLA is being used by the people who deal with English language and literature. APA is used by other social science group. So psychology, economic, they both use APA. But even literature people at times are required to use APA. So some of the papers that I've submitted, they have required me to use APA style. And for engineering and sciences, we mostly use IEEE style. So people coming from humanities and social sciences, they should particularly be well versed with these two, MLA and APA, because different publishers use one of the two. And knowing them well and doing the things right help a lot. Now, last thing which I would want to state, and then I'll stop. So a few things that is, and I'll want to summarize with these things. First is that research is like your own baby, right? You have to nurture it for 5-6 years. And that's why it is really important that you take up something which you can carry out for 5-6 years, or maybe you can simply fall in love with that particular thing so that you can carry it out for the rest of your life. Because in research, it is nothing like pass or fail. It's more like a kind of giving you recognition from the peers, right? So either it is accepted, it is satisfactory, so you feel good about, and if it is a good piece of work that comes out at the end, your peers also start recognizing you as a possible potential scholar for future, right? If it remains hazy, things do not work out that way. So that's why choose something with which you can live for longer. when you write a proposal, begin with a rough draft, have your notes and everything, and then start finalizing. Whenever you write a proposal, set a fixed deadline, because there is nothing like a perfect proposal. No proposal is ever perfect. No writing or no piece of writing is ever perfect. One of the things that you would observe during the literature festivals, that even the writers, they keep going through their chapters, or particularly the thing that they are going to read out, and at places they cut out certain things, make editings even at that point, because they know that something can be said in better words. And that's why, for instance, for me, 12 o'clock was the final deadline for this presentation. So I cut it off at that time. I cannot go longer. And the same fashion for all proposals that you make, funding or otherwise, keep a fixed deadline, finish it at that time, whatever state it is in. But if you have given it sufficient time and have engaged it adequately, it is going to be a good piece of proposal. If you look for perfection, possibly you'll never be able to submit one, right? So deadlines are important, and individual deadlines are important. The next thing I would say is, as Dr. Vandana also said, that it's a bad thing for a scholar to keep reading and not writing. And one of my teachers, who was a Henry James scholar, he said one day, I talked to him during my PhD, and it was almost 1.5 years into registration. And I said that, when should I start writing? Because I've read a lot, but I'm still to start writing about the thesis, start writing the thesis. He said that, look, writing is a painful process and everyone wants to avoid it as long as it is possible. So there is no day when you think that you're ready to start writing. You can start writing from day one, because some of it, because you do multiple drafts of each chapter, right? So some of the writing is simply a kind of warm up, and you do that warm up exercise, and it is good if you do it every day, like you eat every day or exercise every day. And once you do it every day, possibly you'll form a habit, and you'll be a researcher who will be doing work continuously. So for a researcher, like any creative writer, it is important that they write every day and they continue with a schedule. Some people even say that one should fix up the timings and should sit and write for those particular timings each day, so that one gets into a habit of being a perennial, perpetual researcher or a writer. That may be difficult, but still, writing something every day may not be that difficult. As one needs to read every day, one needs to possibly write also every day. Last thing that I'll say, which comes from Coleridge to me, and he wrote an essay actually, which was called Bibliographia. What was it? It was on the practice of writing poetry, where he talks about Biographia Literaria, where he talks about use of meter in poetry and things like that. So he says that poetry works, or the kind of poetry that works is the one where the poet is able to satisfy curiosity and at the same time generate curiosity. It's like a TV serial where you give a certain information or a certain scene to a certain extent, and you cut it at a point where you want to come back to the second phase. It's like Bahubali. So Bahubali 2 you want to see because you want to know why Katappa killed Bahubali, right? So writing is also such a process. You write something and leave it at a point from where you want to begin next day, but you know what is going to be the beginning for the next day. And if you know what is going to be the beginning for the next day, you will possibly be able to think over it over the next 12, 13 hours or 14 hours, and then you can come back to it and write it. Because once you leave it at such a point and you know what is going to be the starting point for the next day, the brain is something which functions as a machine. It automatically starts producing things. It's like as T.S. Eliot says that mind is a processor, right? So you keep feeding it and it will keep processing the things, and ultimately a good thing will emerge. It's a kind of creative machine, and the same thing will happen if you follow this process. So this is my last word for today's presentation. Thank you all very much. Thanks for your time and attention. Let me end with what Winston Churchill says, that success is like walking from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. So there would be times when you'll feel utterly bored with that research process. At times you'll feel like giving up. But only those people who don't give up, they succeed at the end. So that's it. Thank you very much. It's open for
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
This was a wonderful presentation. I request the participants to raise any queries or questions if you have. Somebody has raised hand. Anyone, please go ahead with your questions.
Or maybe it is previously raised hand.
Okay.
I can see Mutkin Khan. She is raised. I don't know if it is previously raised or recently raised.
Mutkin, yes. Mutkin Khan, you may ask the question, please. They were previously raised hand.
So I can see one
is asking.
has written in the chat, which research proposal is called a good proposal? Elaborate a little bit what exactly you are trying to ask in this. Because a good research proposal is the one that is written well, that states the research questions well, that has a good background information, that is has good literature survey. So literature survey is your beginning. Actually, literature survey has to be taken very seriously, because that is what is going to give you what you are going to ask, or what kind of questions you are going to ask in a proposal, and what kind of proposal you're going to give up. So it is something which should help the discipline to grow. If it is based on some human problem, then it should be able to solve some human problem. Or if it is going to help in the sense of policy making. So for instance, when you're writing for ICSR and all, or these funding agencies, they look for policy implications of that. Right. So, for instance, when I wrote that proposal, the policy implication was that I'll be able to produce some work which will help people understand why there is a kind of murky scenario in this region. It will help the understanding, or it will also bring in the viewpoint of the people, because literature does something which journalistic writing does not do. For instance, literature bring out the emotional impact, the psychological impact of the things, which you won't see happening in newspapers, for instance, or other political writing. So that was my implication, or that was my policy intervention, that by doing this, we will also be able to see that how people behaviorally can connect, and how it disrupts day-to-day life, right? Which you see in the case of, for instance, if you see the novels which came after 1971 and dealt with 1971. So I could see that, for instance, a person who is a Pathan or a Punjabi is married to a Bengali woman. How does their relationship go? And how does their relationship function in that particular situation? Because the war is going on. On the one hand, you have Bengalis. On the other hand, you have Punjabis. And if two people of such nature, they are put together, how they are seen by other people in the same locality, right? And the kind of racist hatred that continues for that kind of family, right? So it's not just that we have political problems or the kind of things that we read day in and day out, but there are other issues that happen also at the same time. And that thing comes out when we look at these narrative interventions. And that's where I could prove that even the narratives function as a kind of socio-political discourse. A discourse is happening at that level. Yeah.
I hope the question is answered properly. And if there is any other question, I think no one else has any questions. But we are having very good comments for you, sir. Everybody is thanking you, and for your informative session. Shiva Mehra, Reena Patel, Mutkin Khan, Ramakrishna Mishra, Ilya Khurshid, Mudassar Amin, they have praised this presentation. Anyway, sir, shall we call this a day now?
Yeah, I'll be fine with that.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you, sir. It has been a very informative session, sir. I'm thankful to you that you have spared us your precious time and added value to your workshop, to our workshop. It was your as well. Thank you once again, sir.
And thank you for
Dear
inviting
participants,
me. Yeah.
thank you, sir. Thank
I
you.
feel
And
close to the place because I have lived there, and it has been, I mean, it has added a dimension to my own identity.
why not? Why not, sir?
Yeah.
So, thank you for being with us. And Uh, this is an announcement for all this participants that we are going to end this session. Anyone who has not yet marked the attendance may please go to the comment section and copy the link. Uh, uh, let's meet again tomorrow with the very informative sessions which we are going to take up with Dr. Raj Thakur and Dr. Isha Malhotra. Thank you for being with us so patiently and making all the sessions fruitful and vibrant. Thank you all. See you tomorrow.
I think
Bye-bye.
Pratibha has something, just a last question, if I can attempt. When we want to write research article, we supposed to read some papers. What are the main points we have to read? See, in the case of papers, you the thing which is easier in the case of sciences, social sciences and all, is that you read the gaps. So even the people who write these papers, they show the limitations and challenges, and whether you are going to you are able to fill up those gaps and challenges. That's how research actually grows there. So they give you challenges, they give you limitations, and you work to uh, overcome those limitations or overcome those challenges. In the case of literary studies, what you'll do is when you read something, you'll figure out that a particular thing that you yourself have studied possibly opens a different dimension to the same problem, right? So the important thing which you do when you read a paper is the conclusion, particularly how, and second thing which is also important is that how the person is reaching to that conclusion, right? So if, in a way, when you do a paper, it becomes important in its entirety. But when you do a book, you don't have to read it from page to page. So in the case of a book, you can possibly look at introduction more, you can look at the conclusion part then, and then if you find something substantial there, then you can look at a specific chapter which you find of interest. But in the case of paper, at least abstract, conclusion, and if you find conclusion enticing, then you can look for how that conclusion is arrived at, because it's not just the conclusion that is important, but how the person reaches that conclusion. And in that process, you can figure out gaps, because somewhere, if the person is not following that properly or missing out some link, you have scope for another paper there.
Thank you, sir. I think we have two more participants who have come up with their questions. We again have this raised hand of Mutkin Khan. Anyway, Ramakrishna Mishra, if you have any questions, you have raised your hands. Please tell us. Okay, these are the previously raised hands.
No questions, sir.
Anyway, okay, no questions. Okay, now I request Shaista
Hello.
Sadiq.
Hello.
She's a, yes, sir.
Yes,
sir.
Shiv Shetty has a question.
Shiv Shetty. Yeah,
Yes, Shiv.
Doctor, I'm simply a postgraduate in English. I just have got a query. This is a wonderful presentation and a lot of things I've learned. My query is, one is critical review, reading books, and review of articles, very nicely, in presentation, this has been explained. Supposing I have got my personal views, ideas, I present in the shape of book or short stories. Will that be counted as a, contribution towards such, not research, a new piece of work?
Well, see, in India we have a slightly different system. Otherwise, yes, it is a contribution, and some at some places even anthologies are considered as contribution. But one thing that I like fascinating about the Western system, for instance, so the writer that I worked on, Carol Phillips, he also teaches, and he teaches at Yale University in USA, and he's a professor there. So I find that his contribution in the form of fiction, for instance, should be considered, because even for writing fiction, you need to do a lot of research. So when he's talking about slavery or slave trade or the Holocaust, it is not possible to write that kind of fiction without doing enough research. And he does a lot of research for doing all that kind of thing. So even the creative writing is based on a lot of research and should be considered as a kind of contribution. But for that, institutions have to be a little open. So you'll find that some institutions which have a little more autonomy may consider contributions of that nature, and creative writing should be considered in some way. That's my personal view. But regulatory agencies have their own way of working. So
regarding my, just query, how about UGC, how they take it? Or some funding agencies? Personal ideas, I put it shape into, of course, for generating personal ideas, one has to read a lot of writers, their books, their thought process, and then one can reach to, learn something, how one can present the idea, because that is again very important,
Yes,
although we may not, copy those works, but
that is true.
some ideas we get it, how a proper, like you told, some fantasy is created, we keep one episode at this point and when to start the next one to generate a curiosity, So, like this thing, I have got a couple of ideas with my own experience. I wanted to put it down. I am not sure whether these will be considered as a qualifying mark. Supposing I join for this PhD or something.
For PhD, yes, it will not be considered. Creative piece of creative writing may not be considered for that kind of thing.
Okay.
Except in the case of honorary degrees, because even in the cases of like I talked about Carol Phillips, he's not a PhD, although he has honorary degrees of that nature, DLit and all, he's been given. But a formal PhD is not awarded to him even there, and it will not be done here. But for funding, you can look for places like Sahit Academy or these places where if you want to do more of creative writing, they can do it. But this kind of work that you have done, there is another specific field, which is the field of creative writing. So there, this kind of work can qualify even for that kind of thing, but not in the English studies kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thanks.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, can I ask one question, sir?
Sure, please.
Yes, sir. Right now, sir, actually, this is my perception. Right now, UGC has given much more emphasis regarding research. And being a, sir, I'm working as an associate professor in finance in one MBA colleges. So I'm very busy in taking classes and I'm doing research also. But can it be possible the research and teaching at a time, sir? What is your suggestions actually? A good teacher cannot be a good researcher because and for that we need some time. So and right now, sir, I have seen in my life I have having 22-year experience in field academician. And I am seeing in my life so many my colleagues, they are just like a printing the ABC journal and they are in a good position, but they are not a real teacher. They do not know the basic concept of all the finance. So, sir, what is your suggestion, advice, please, sir? Give me, sir, advice. So how I'll manage? Because I'm a little bit the exception to that part. That's why, sir, I'm working in a that is self-financing very good colleges. But previously, before that, I was in nursing in Mumbai. So please, sir, just give me some 2 lines.
I think if it is a self-finance college, they themselves also can have some flexibility. UGC is now giving some flexibility, particularly those who have got NAC accreditation and all. So, for instance, we are a self-financed institution.
Sir.
We had the AICT UGC visit last time, and they asked us, The question that they asked us was that do you have your own promotion policy or you follow UGC and AICTE? And we said that we have our own promotion policy here because we actually follow the system which is being followed at IITs. And IITs don't need to follow UGC's regulations regarding promotions. And in the similar way, self-financed institutions also have the flexibility if they so want to do, if they want to take it, that they can have their own promotion policies. In our case, we have. So it's not like somebody who is too busy with teaching and expected to produce enormous amount of research. Research is important. Yes, research informs the teaching also. But if somebody is teaching, say, for instance, core courses all the time, and not elective courses, how much time the person will have for research. So that is true, and that is a serious bottleneck actually. The research has gone in kind of number game, which does not help that much, because when you talk about research, you also need something new coming up, and at times it's similar thing being projected in so many papers and things like that. So many things of that nature are happening. Yes, that is true.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
We need to have actually a more flexible regulatory framework.
Sir. That should be, sir. Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all the participants for inquiries and questions. This has really made this session very interactive. I now request our scholar, Shaista Siddiq, to wind up this session with the lines for formal voting. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It has been such an honor to be the part. It has been such an honor to be the part of this workshop. On behalf of Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Management, I would like to extend my heartful gratitude first and foremost speakers, Dr. Vandana Sharma and Dr. Narendra Kumar. Thank you so much, sir, for lending us your time. Our special thanks goes to HOD, Professor Abdul Liman, faculty members, research scholars, and organizing team. And last but not least, our wonderful audience. Thank you one and all, and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you, Shivani, and my thanks to the entire department at NIT Srinagar and to Dr. Nasir for giving me this opportunity and this privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with what Mudassir Amin said, that it is possible that a good researcher can be a good teacher, and a good research do inform a lot of teaching, yes. And at times you can actually use your research for teaching. So for instance, I did this project on ethnic conflict. I also teach a course on ethnic conflict now. So that's where I have been able to use my research for teaching. So thank you for bringing that up, Mudassir. Thank you.